welcome to our Urban Growth Seminar. I think this is our fourth one. Fifth. Okay. And we're very fortunate to have a distinguished attorney, planner, policymaker, Dr. Robert Freilich. Dr. Freilich is his official title is UVM, Dual Professor of Law, Emeritus of the University of Missouri, Institute of Law. He is considered one of the nation's leading experts in land use and land use law and real estate, and he has been sort of the forefront of the sustainable growth management planning over the last several years. His interest includes things like urbanism, regional transportation, renewable energy, and green development systems, all of those topics that we're all interested in here. He's a respected, highly respected litigator. Dr. Freilich has tried and argued more than 160 cases throughout the country, including several before the U.S. Supreme Court. So he has an elevated level of experience with these things that which is a very distinguished career. He has his own law firm, Freilich and Populated, which represented over 250 cities, counties, regions, and states, 30 California, across the nation of growth management, green development and sustainability, and from San Diego to Boston, Seattle, to great country. So he has recently developed major regional transportation regulations and plans for Monterey County, California, Ada County, if I'm pronouncing it right, Idaho, Santa Fe County, New Mexico, Miami-Dade County, Florida, the Puget Sound region in Seattle, Washington. He has also developed systems for monetization of solar, wind turbine, and rainwater capture systems. I'm not going to, that's about half, so I'm going to give it a bridge version of the rest of the, because we need to get on with, I'm sure, the presentation is interesting and more questions. He has served in various capacities in many law institutions and professional associations, the national editor of the Urban Lawyer and the Urban Journal, and we have a quarterly journal of the state and local government and the Bar Association, the chair of the planning law division of the American Planning Association, he's the advisory board of the Environment 97 Law Review, member of AICP and the Urban Land Institute. I just want to just briefly, Freilich is a graduate of Yale Law School, and I don't think I need to.
I can throw.
And he just finished, published his book, which we'll be hearing about more from him.
Here it is.
So, so our rule is that we'll have about 40 minutes or so, your presentation,
Right.
and then we're fortunate to have our colleague, Professor Hilda Blanco, who is a professor at SCPD and also the director of the Center for Technical Cities. So we Hilda will get about 10 minutes. And then we'll open up for Q&A and discussion. So with that, please join me giving Dr. Freilich a hand.
Okay. Well, it's wonderful to see so many people really, interested in planning, and you'll get a little, won't get too much law on this thing. You're going to get a lot of policy and implementation of regional planning and everything. So, but I have a doctorate in both planning and law, so they call me Dr. Bob. So it's very, so wherever I go, it's always Dr. Bob, and makes it nice and informal. And by the way, a big secret, if you want to really represent 250 cities, counties, and regional things, the best way of doing that, and the best way of approaching sort of any project where they're interested in possibly you want to join, a request for proposals or whatever it is basically to suggest to the people that you'll do a workshop for them. No cost. You'll just go, you'll meet with their city council or, or the leaders, etc. And you'll talk about, well, what happens, if you don't change anything in your system for the next 20 years? Where are you going to be 20 years from now? You'll get the documents, you'll look at them, and then you'll make some suggestions about different alternatives. Never give anybody a fixed solution. That's a huge mistake. You never ever want, you always want to say, listen, I'm here to give you the options and the choices, and if push comes to shove, and you ask me, I'll even give you a recommendation, but I will not tell you what to do. Because you ran for office, and you wanted to run for office because you wanted to have the great joy of making decisions. Isn't that why you ran for office, right? Of course, that's not true of Congress. But basically, and that's how you deal with people. You give them alternatives, and you meet with them, and there's no program on the agenda, there's no contract, there's no developer, there's no project, and you're just talking this way. And then at the end of the session, they'll say, well, maybe we could call on you for this, that, or the other thing. So I know that part of going through school, nobody ever really teaches you how to operate a practice, okay? And how to actually be a planning professional. And so it's very, very important for you to study different techniques, read a couple of books, read other articles about how you take this information that you've learned and basically put it into a format that you can actually work with communities and so forth. I'll give you one simple example. A few years ago, I went to, I got a call for, Champaign-Urbana, which is like USC. It's a big school, and their close-in neighborhood next to it was fundamentally getting overrun with multifamily housing, rooming houses, duplexes, because students and faculty and other people associated with the university needed housing, and the university was growing, etc. People in the neighborhood were extremely resistant. It was mostly single-family housing. So they said, come on in, Bob, and help us, put something together. So I did a little study, had a planning firm with me, and we studied, and we said, well, this was an 88 square block neighborhood. And we determined that the need for multifamily housing over the next 20 years was 4 blocks. That's all we needed, was 4 blocks. So I went to the community and I said, listen, I just need 4 blocks out of 88. Why don't you find me 4 blocks? I didn't say, here's where we're going to do the zoning or this is it. I said, find me 4 blocks. And they came back with 8 blocks. They said, you know what? We realized we could put some housing here. There's a bus stop here. There's some, some retail over here. Over here is where it's closest to the university, and so we could allow some dorms or other things here. So came up with 8 blocks. And so the whole concept of working with people is don't ever tell them what to do. Okay? Find the mechanism to reach so they can make decisions. And this is really a very important part of the practice. This is the new book I just published with Sitkowski and Manillo. Bob Sitkowski, by the way, is a great expert on form-based codes and new urbanism. Here's the book. Any of you interested in buying it, I can get you 50% off. Can't give it away, okay? But it covers everything from sprawl, as you can see, to sustainability, smart growth, new urbanism, green development, renewable energy. It's a great resource. It has over 1,600 footnotes in it and is a little bit semi-autobiographical. Okay, so I think I'm going backwards. Is that what's happening? Yeah. Okay. So I thank my partner and Neil Popowitz for helping me put together this very creative PowerPoint. But I don't really read from PowerPoints, but it'll just help you. This can be posted, I understand, on your web. Is that it, the website? So really, what we're really talking about here is global warming is overtaking all of us. Now, if you're Republicans and you don't believe in global warming or you don't believe in science, you're going to be in trouble for the next 30 years, right? Because the whole world is going to pass you by. So basically, this is Thomas Friedman. He's not one of my greatest heroes, because Thomas Friedman is the big advocate of a flat world and globalization, which I think has done more damage to more countries, etc. But you see what he says is, we're going to have to be more green, and we're going to have to grow upward rather than outward, where mass transit becomes the norm rather than mass traffic jams, where the only new buildings are green buildings. Well, he's an idealist, right? And but one of the things that's really interesting about this whole question of density is when we get into, right, the only thing Americans really hate worse than urban sprawl is density, okay? So if you're growing out in single family, large lot, detached lots, and you're consuming more and more space, and it's great, and we're going to see the great problems that are created by the growth that we've had, and now we see counties on the whole fringe. Look at San Bernardino County, you look at northern San Diego County and western, you look at Riverside County. These places are desolate now because we jumped over land, went out further and further and further, and the net result is that we sold them, homes that they couldn't afford, but they don't have any walkable communities. They don't have jobs near them. Everything is a hugely expensive commutes, etc. And their neighborhoods, they look around and 50% of every house is on the market or either in foreclosure. And we see the net effect of what our policy of sprawl has really brought us in America. So I like to talk about 5 scales of sustainability, and today we'll focus a little more on the region. But of course, it comes all the way from the neighborhood to the city, to the individual dwelling, neighborhood, city, region, global. And any planner worth his or her salt in the coming 20 years is going to have to understand that this problem has 5 dimensions to it. And to learn, how to deal with each of these different dimensions. And that's, I think, the most exciting thing in the world, because right now, while it's very difficult to get jobs from cities and counties and regions because they're all laying people off. I mean, if they're laying off policemen, they're not going to hire planners. And fundamentally, that's why it's a great idea for you to be in school right now, okay? Because the dam is going to break loose, because we're seeing whole new efforts away from where zoning was only a local matter. States didn't care at all about, what was going on. And now we're seeing it, at every level. So I call it the umbrella of sustainability. Smart growth, new urbanism, and green building. And of course, I couldn't get under the umbrella unless you can see in 270 degrees the word renewable energy, okay? But it's all really under one heading. So when people talk to you about sustainable growth or sustainability, it has multi-facets, okay? Now, here's a typical definition of sprawl, right? Low density, right? Designed without any relationship to the environment or to the actual historical or cultural sectors, okay? It's automobile dependent, right? It has no adequate public facilities, because you have to understand the development industry in America is the most subsidized industry in the world, except for sugar. Because every developer since 1950 has gone out and built homes. But they didn't build parks or schools or open space or transit or roads, fire and police, they all said that was a community response. See, I built these homes, and now it's the community's responsibility to furnish this infrastructure. So, of course, none of it got built. Because, think about it, who is the community? Everybody who's already living there is the community. So they're going to pay for a vast percentage of the facilities, the need for which is generated by the development. And so what happens is that more and more and more we see our infrastructure crisis arising, okay? So we have to understand that the opposite of that insane form of development that we saw for the last 50 years or 60 years is to basically develop the present, right, without leaving the needs for infrastructure, for environmental protection, for open space, for health, for all of these things to future generations to solve, okay? And the ability of this to do this over time is a critical aspect of sustainable development. So when you look at smart growth, the first of the umbrellas, okay, the first of the categories, what you have is, instead of just leapfrogging out further and further and further, we're now more interested in compact development. Now, it doesn't mean that everything is infill back into the cities, or even back into existing first and second ring suburbs. But take Atlanta, for example. Atlanta now is in the 7th ring of development. Every decade there's a new ring of development. You cannot move on Atlanta's transportation network. It's absolutely gridlock everywhere because nobody has any transportation. Yeah, there's MARTA, and MARTA runs, you know, about 12 miles out, but Atlanta's growth is 70 miles out. Okay? And so everybody has to go from housing to jobs to everything all over the place with no rational system of growth. So even if you're building in the suburbs or further out, you need to build compact. So you have mixed use, walkable communities where you have some industry, some jobs, you have your community centers, you have your, essentially, your retail and your shopping and your recreation, all within a community that's walkable. And so that's what's important is, you want to strengthen and direct developments, true, towards existing communities, downtowns, existing cities, first and second ring suburbs, but you want to utilize the urban services and infrastructure you already have, rather than to allow building to go where there are no adequate facilities available, and just a promise that they'll be built in the future. You want to tie land use and transportation plans to how many miles will the average citizen travel. If they're traveling 40 miles a day on the interstate system, not only their costs enormous, but the congestion, okay, and the destruction of communities. And now you'll see as we go along that the Federal Transportation Act and all of these regional transportation and land use plans are now mandatory to have regional plans. And how are these cities going to basically look at this? And you're going to see much more state legislation. See what happened in 1920 when zoning was invented, and the Standard Planning Enabling Act and the Standard Zoning Enabling Acts were created, by the way, by Herbert Hoover. That's the most important thing he's remembered for, is the fact that he, as Secretary of Commerce, promoted these 2 Standard Planning Enabling Acts. So everything from the state was given to cities, and only after World War II was it given to counties to do their own zoning and their own planning. Well, how many municipalities are there in Los Angeles County? 87. 87 municipalities, all running their own direction, and all chasing the dollar, sales tax dollars, all chasing industry and commerce and so forth. How many communities are there in the 7-county region? How many cities and counties are there? 275. All having their own zoning. Counties do zoning for only their unincorporated territories. So if you get elected on the Board of Supervisors for Los Angeles County, and there are 5 supervisors for 9 million people, 5 elected officials, where does most of their votes come from? Since they're county-wide, they come from the cities. But they only do land use and zoning in unincorporated areas of the county. And so they don't care what happens to the cities. They don't design county plans that help cities. They only design county plans for their unincorporated areas. And so everybody is fragmented in the whole region. And by the way, it's no different in most of the world, okay? So what does smart growth try to do? We try to limit growth, and I'm going to show you, through tiered growth boundaries, transportation corridors, or mixed-use centers. We want to create central places. We want to preserve environmentally sensitive land, and we want to reduce transportation congestion, vehicle miles traveled, and climate change. And the leading expert, urban economist in the country, is Robert Burchell out of Rutgers University. And if you just go to the library and look up and actually read some of these things, you will learn so much, okay? Because what are people concerned about today? When you go out to a county, you go to a city, you go to a region, they're interested in, will I save money? Over the next 10 years, will I produce a positive fiscal impact? Will I have enough money to do what we want to do? Or am I going to wastefully be spending money? Talk dollars to people, because dollars are what people are interested today in a declining economy with high unemployment. And so you learn, read about urban economics, read fiscal impact studies. Burchell has 4 or 5 of them. Just go take them home, and instead of watching some stupid TV program, spend a couple of hours really learning about fiscal impact and how it developed, through states, regions, counties, and cities. Okay? So this is what we're talking about. The difference between sprawl and smart growth is we separate uses. That's what zoning was all about. Everybody didn't want to live, if you were single family, next to multifamily. So you had single family districts, multifamily districts, commercial districts, industrial districts, warehouse districts. Nobody lived where they worked. Nobody shopped where they lived. All of this stuff. Now the biggest problem in the United States is converting all these regional shopping centers, which are falling into total disorientation, into mixed-use communities. Actually taking those shopping centers and reconverting them. That's a big job for planners. So maximum densities instead of minimum. See, the trouble with zoning was, we zone you R1, 1 unit per acre. Now you could build 1 unit for 50 acres, or 1 unit for 100 acres, or 1 unit for 1,000 acres. But you can't build more than 1 per acre. So it was so sprawl was essentially limiting the densities. You could go lower and lower and lower, but you can never go higher. It's exactly the opposite with smart growth. We now say to people, you want to build in our transit corridor centers or in our mixed-use communities, you now have to build a minimum of 6 units per acre. You can go up higher and higher, but you can't go lower. That's a whole different framework of how we see planning operating. And you can see street standards designed for pedestrians. These curvilinear streets and these cul-de-sacs. The city of Los Angeles is out of its mind the way it runs its neighborhoods. Every single neighborhood has these speed bumps and these cul-de-sacs, and they stop, you can't go through. So you never know. So every bit of traffic has to come out onto Wilshire or Pico or Olympic. And you wonder why they're so overcongested. Because we have no interconnectivity. Go to cities like New York. There isn't a single street that isn't connected to everything. You go east, west, north, south, and you can travel on the streets. You don't stop neighborhoods. And these people think, oh, by stopping these neighborhoods, by stopping the traffic within our neighborhoods, we're really creating a better situation for ourselves. Well, if everything is interconnected, the traffic is lower. And secondly, everybody uses, Neil and I always chat about this. If you see a speed bump, that's the street you want to travel on because you know it's going somewhere. They wouldn't put a speed bump on a street, right? So the through streets are the ones with the speed bumps. So that tells you right away that the whole effort to have the speed bumps is totally, right? It's not working. But that's what planners think. And you go to neighborhoods and you listen to these people, they say, we don't want, stop the world, we want to get off. Why? Because they don't know whether a project proposed is the first of one or the first of 100. And if you don't use quota systems or planning and say, how much density can this neighborhood take? And how long should it absorb that density so people get confidence that they're not going to be overrun by projects. But everything in this city is done behind doors, politically oriented. Everything is a deal. So citizens actually, they'll say, stop the world, I want to get off. I don't know what's going on. We have neighborhood plans, but we don't have any idea of how much capacity really are in those plans or when they're going to be built. Okay? Now we have a public infrastructure deficit in the nation now approaching $7 trillion. Okay? That's larger than any other economy in the world. $7 trillion. Okay? So why? Because we built and built and built and built no transmission corridors. We built no sewer and water. We built, we had septic tanks. We didn't capture rainwater. We didn't provide for, for roads. We certainly didn't provide for schools and parks and fire facilities, etc. So how, this is what we have to make up in the coming years. And I'm going to explain to you. Take Boise, Idaho. Boise, Idaho is in a county called Ada County, Idaho. It's got a metropolitan population of about 1.5 million. Okay? The county is unique because it has only, one county transportation road public works service. So cities don't have their own. So it's countywide. 15 years ago, Ada County spent 95% of the money it raised from taxes on new roads. 10 years ago, 50% on new roads because every year the road network was expanding by 70 road miles every year. Today, right now, they cannot build one new road from their tax revenue. Not one new road. Because to maintain the existing system takes all of their money. It's sprawl. They're adding for 20 years, they added 1,400 miles of roadway leading to nowhere. And that's what's happening to every major region in the United States. So if you really begin to understand these issues, look at the Bank of America. This is probably the most conservative institution in the world, okay? And look what it says. This is 15 years ago. It says, growth has helped fuel unparalleled economic and population boom, enabling millions to realize the enduring dream of home ownership. But sprawl has created enormous costs. And ironically, unchecked sprawl has shifted from an engine of growth to a force that now threatens to inhibit growth and degrade the quality of our life. Too bad nobody paid any attention to them 15 years ago. Okay? Well, here's the project that made Dr. Bob, right, get 250 cities, counties, and states. In 1965, okay, down here is New York City, okay, the George Washington Bridge, and this Palisades Interstate Parkway was built, all right, connecting to the George Washington Bridge. So it's about 22 miles to this glorious Dutch apple farm country called Rockland County. Okay? And suddenly, as soon as they built that road and the New York State Thruway, suddenly everybody was rushing out. And they were building houses, 1 unit for every 2 acres. That was it, 1 unit for every 2 acres. Okay? And in 7 years, they were going to consume the entire county and then push on to Orange County. Okay? 45 miles from New York City. Okay? Nice. Okay? Good thinking. So the Democrats won in 1965, and for the first time since the Civil War, they took over, right, the county leadership, and they basically took this township of Ramapo and said, we're going to put a growth control system in here. I had delivered a lecture at Columbia University in 1962, and basically the supervisor of the whole county heard it, and he said, okay, Bob, you got it. And he said, now that we got elected on controlled growth, he says, how are you going to do it? And I said, I don't have the faintest idea. Because you see, the problem with zoning is that you zone, right, 1 unit for whatever you do, and then that person can build immediately. So if the entire county is zoned, anybody can build anywhere in the county. There was no timing, sequencing. A very famous planner, okay, in 1955, talked about the fact that we need to develop growth management, timing, and sequencing of development. So that's what I did. I basically took this 145 square mile area, and it had basically three existing cities. And I said, we're going to create 3 6-year capital improvement programs, all right, for all sewer, water, schools, open space, fire, all right, parks. And if you don't have adequate public facilities, you can only build inside of years 1 to 6. So all these people couldn't build for 7 to 18 years. The case went up to the US Supreme Court, first to the New York Court of Appeals, and the court said it was constitutional. I won. Okay, and suddenly this young 36-year-old guy, you know, suddenly became, right? I got Honolulu in 2 months, I got Portland, Seattle, Minneapolis, Palm Beach, Miami, you name it, everywhere in the country. I did all their plans. And all based on the whole idea of timing. Mrs. Golden, the famous case was Golden versus the Planning Board. She owned 40 acres up here. And so the National Home Builders Association chose her to bring the suit because she couldn't build until year 18. So, you know, she lost. And by the way, she had a contract to sell her 40 acres for $10,000 an acre. Okay? So when this plan ran out, and her 18 years came up, okay, in 1990, I get a telegram from her. She said, a telegram. Nobody ever used Western Union anymore, right? She sends me a telegram. She says, call me. Bob, she says, call me. So I called her up. She said, thank God you weren't my attorney, she said, because I just sold my land, okay, for $400,000 an acre. You know why? What is it that any real estate broker tells you about value? Anybody in the class can tell me? The famous real estate broker. Anybody from in the real estate development here? What do they say? Where do you buy? Location, location, location. Did you ever ask the broker, location to what? Good schools? You mean there are schools there? There are roads there. There are parks there. There's sewer and water there, right? There's recreation. There's open space. Ah, it's adequate public facilities that create value, okay? So that's what it's all about. So we move along, okay? Am I going backwards now? Yes, I am. I can't believe this. Some days it goes one way. Okay, so here's San Diego. So I then, in 1976, I get the contract to do the city of San Diego. Now, the city of San Diego at the time in 1976 contained 167 square miles of downtown and urbanized neighborhoods. So we called that the urbanized area. So working with Pete Wilson, who later became governor, and if he had been smart and continued to follow the path he took when he was mayor, he would have been president of the United States. Instead, he veered to the right and became anti-immigration and all kinds of things and lost his foothold. So fundamentally, what we did was in the next 20 years, we said we're going to build only along these transportation corridors. I-5 going to Los Angeles, I-15 to Las Vegas, and I-8. That should be an 8, and this red area is actually along the interstate that goes, all right, to Tucson. So what happened? In 1979, when we completed this plan, oh, by the way, we charged every single unit of new development outside the urbanized area 100% of the cost of off-site capital improvements, the need for which they developed. Schools, the whole works came to $27,000 a unit in 1979. You know what it did to the value of the homes they were selling? It raised them by $180,000 because they had all these facilities. And so guess what happened? By 1983, this was some growth control program, right? You see the Ramapo plan? We're going to do the capital improvements 20 years and then 20 to 40 years. 16,000 building permits a year now instead of 9, but where before 8,000 were going outside and only 1,000 were going into this 167 square mile area, now 8,000 units were coming back into the downtown and the existing areas. Why? Because what you do on the outside is far more important than all the urban redevelopment programs, subsidies, grants, bonuses, incentives. They don't work. What works is charge more outside, and we didn't charge these fees inside because we already had sewer and water. Yeah, they needed some work and they weren't always sufficient. Do you know how many buildings over 20 stories were in existence in 1979? 30 years of the American Urban Renewal Program, $2 billion, built one unit, 20 stories. From 1979 to 2009, 30 buildings over 20 stories in downtown San Diego. So you get the picture? That's what you do. When you look at the region. You look and say, how do I deal with this? And of course, along here, we had a famous case against Del Mar because we built this area in here called North City West and University City. Each community has over 100,000 people. Mixed use, walkable. They sued us, and I won the first case in California history on regional general welfare. Okay? So what you really want to look at is, you know, how these things work. I don't know. It switches back and forth. Okay, now, went up to Seattle, Tacoma. Okay? So here's Seattle, Tacoma. And I developed this growth management plan. Here was the urban growth boundary. Okay? And then we created these high density centers, okay, around the cities and such. There's Tacoma down here, here's Seattle, you know, here's up in Everest and Olympia. Okay, so we did that. 20 years later, all those centers became the transportation stops on a $12 billion transit system. Because you don't build transit when there's no ridership. You first build the ridership into transit-oriented developments, higher intensity, quarter of a mile. Nobody will walk in California more than a quarter of a mile. I don't care that you walk 5 miles for your exercise, but if you're going to work, you won't walk more than a quarter of a mile. So that's how you begin to build regional transportation and networks. Now take a look at the federal acts, okay? In metropolitan planning, okay, this is the latest, okay, you know, it's called SAFE-T, okay. It requires metropolitan planning organizations. These are your regional planning organizations. What are they in this region? SCAG, Southern California area of governments. That consists of which counties? It consists of Orange, Los Angeles, Ventura, San Bernardino, and Riverside. Okay? So you begin to understand that that's the region. And what do? They have to develop regional transportation and land use plans, right? Which includes multimodal transportation, Clean Air Act, and smart growth policies. And all federally funded road projects now have to be consistent with the transportation and land use plan. So as we'll see later, even though California's adopted SB 375, a bill that basically says you build in accordance with how many greenhouse gas emissions that you're contributing, the fact of the matter is we're waiting now. The House passed this bill, H.R. 2454, last June. We're still waiting 18 months. We don't have an energy and climate legislation. But it's going to be tied into the new Transportation Act because they have to fund transportation by the end of the year. Okay? Here's California's system. Okay? Now, what do you have? In 2002 in California, they passed a bill, AB 857, which established planning priorities for growth and development, including development into areas with existing infrastructure, reducing vehicle miles traveled, and protecting agricultural land. Wowee, right? Smart growth. That's it. And then what? Then they did a strategic growth plan. And basically now, no California road investments, no bridges, no anything, unless they're designated as priority growth areas in regional plans. Okay? And then came along the famous global warming. And by the way, vote, because Prop 23, right, is calling for the cancellation, right, the revocation of this act, the global warming. They want to go back, right, to the desert, okay? So, and then in 2008 came SB 375, Transportation Planning Sustainable Community Strategy Act. Regional Transportation and Land Use Plans, they're called SCSs, Sustainable Community Strategies. And if they can't agree on that, then they do what they call Alternative Community Strategies, ACSs, just like the alternatives I told you about. And basically, you have to plan to reduce your emissions, your greenhouse gas emissions, by reducing vehicle miles traveled, prioritizing smart growth, and using new urbanism patterns of development. Now, it's not binding on cities, but if cities don't do this, they won't get any transportation projects. So this is what we're facing now. So what has SCAG done? It hasn't finished the new plan, but now they've got priority growth areas, metro centers, city centers, rail transit stops, bus rapid transit corridors, airports, priority residential infill, new towns, and traditional neighborhood and transit consists of mixed-use jobs, housing, balanced land uses. No more sprawl. It's gone. It's gone. And so what you're looking at now, okay, here is a project I did for the California high-speed rail. They were originally going to run their right-of-way for the California high-speed rail through Interstate 5. So we got them to move it, okay, and to create a new stop up here in Lancaster and Palmdale, because their first stop was up in the Central Valley, which, by the way, feeds 60% of America's fruit and vegetables, right? 60% are grown in California's Central Valley. But Sprawl is eating it up, 1 unit for every 5 acres, but no more, okay? And once we move the high-speed rail, now suddenly people are realizing they don't, do you know that from Bakersfield to downtown LA on the high-speed rail, 42 minutes. A trip that takes 3 hours and 45 minutes today on the freeways is 42 minutes on the high-speed rail at $8 round trip. $8 round trip. You can't park, right, in downtown LA for less than $24 to $32, okay? So what's happening is we're really, we're really now developing, techniques to deal with that. And then we move along, I'll move quickly along. So here is the new urbanism: compact development, utilize existing infrastructure, tying land use to reduce vehicle miles traveled. So here's a typical new urbanist community, okay, where you can see the shopping areas, you can see the schools, the parks, everything is walkable. Okay? You want to restore human scale and place. That's what new urbanism is all about. Okay? What's the difference between this building and a typical single-family, right, outlying development? What's the difference? What is the prominent feature of every single-family home built in California? The garage, right? You got a 3-car garage, it takes the whole front. There's a little tiny doorway over here where you can get into the house. That's your front door. So we know we call those homes snout homes, okay? Snout homes, because that's what they're referred to in the planning profession, okay? Snout homes. So instead, you can create greater density, but far more walkable communities. And by the way, it's interesting, in this recession, you know which properties are going up tremendously in value? Rental properties. People aren't buying single-family homes anymore, and we're moving more into multifamily and into rentals. The occupancy rates in Los Angeles dropped, increased by 6% in the last 9 months. Okay, so what do you want to do? Rainwater capture. Oh, it's my favorite subject. Okay, rainwater capture. Basically, it rains in Los Angeles 13 inches a year. 13 inches a year. If we captured all of that water off the rooftops and put them into cisterns, you know who had cisterns? The Babylonians, 6,000 years ago. They lived in this arid desert, and they captured their rainwater. And amazing, 6,000 years ago, and we're so far behind them. Right? Every single drop of water in Los Angeles runs off the roof into the gutters, into the stream, down into the Santa Monica Bay. We lose billions and billions of gallons a year of water. And you know what the price of water is? Now we're bringing it in from Northern California. The Colorado River is running dry, so our allotment of California river water is dropping 20% next year. 20%. That means the price of water is going up again, another 20%. We're paying enormous sums of money to bring water when we have all this water that just runs into the bay. What kind of planners did we have? Where were they? What kind of thinking is that? Okay? That's not lawyers. Lawyers don't build planning systems. They don't build cities. They don't build towns. They just litigate all this stuff, right? Develop ordinances to implement this stuff. So that's what you need to do, is basically store the rain, right? Harvest it, treat it, and restore it, and reuse it. And it's going to reduce your water utility rates by 50%. Not only that, we can get developers to put it in free because we create these public improvement districts and we bond it. And then the consumers, the purchasers of the units, pay it off from the savings that they have, these huge savings. Okay? Same thing with rooftop solar. Can reduce electric utilities by 80%. Do you imagine what this is just huge savings for the citizens and the businesses and everything in California, okay? So what are we doing? If you just mount a wind turbine of 4 to 10 kilowatts, it costs $30,000 to 40, and it can meet 100% of your electrical needs, and you amortize it over 20 years. What does it mean? Nothing. It's $150 a month, and you're paying now $500, $600. Okay, so green development, okay, mass transit, mix of housing, these are books that you can read on all of this stuff, okay? And so basically, buildings account for 72% of all electricity consumption. Why aren't we using solar and wind on buildings? Why? Because neighborhoods say, we don't like solar rooftops because they're not pretty. And you know what? I'm going to get cancer. Somehow or other, solar energy is going to produce cancer. And you know what? It reflects off of the rooftops, and I might catch a ray or two every once in a while, right? All right. So this is all about LEEDs and the benefits of green development, right? Because you can actually build buildings now with recyclable materials. You can reduce the use of plastics and all of this. You're achieving reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, etc. And the health, the internal health of these buildings, from these acoustic and better air quality, the comfort and the health, all of these things are all part of green building. Okay, and again, these are some books that you can look at. These are the different systems in the United States that basically give certificates for green development. The most important one is LEED, Leadership for Energy and Environmental Design, and they do it for homes, neighborhoods, commercials, new construction, schools, okay? And they're growing in the number of certified projects, etc. We just don't have time to do this, okay? Because of the thing, but you can read about all of this stuff, okay? So I just want to get to something like this, okay? So here's a smart code. Now you've heard of Duane, Plater, Zyberg. I worked with them in saving the ag land in the Redlands in Florida. So they have this whole thing, where they developed this transect concept of planning, okay? Which, sort of works for neighborhoods, but I think most people today would say it's not something you can use for the region. It's another fellow who peddled something like this was Lane Kendig, who peddled performance zoning, and it fell crashing to earth because nobody could figure out what the standards were. Okay, so basically, this is how they try to stick these transects onto plans, and there was their very famous first project, Seaside, Florida. And you can see how they did it. They worked from the inside out, okay? And this is another one in Montgomery, Alabama, and this is Peoria, Illinois, where it's much higher, intensity, okay? It's just showing. I'll go back to the streets. So you can see every single street, okay, is interconnected, okay? And urban standards, they go through all of this stuff, architectural standards, etc. Okay, so that's the story. I wanted to give you the idea to see that there is a structure out there. There is something you can work towards, and I'll stop. And Hilda, wants to have some comments, etc. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bob. I think I'm going to do two major comments. The first one, I just want to highlight how important Dr. Bob's influence on urban and regional planning has been. I think the Ramapo case was that he argued successfully in New York and U.S. high courts really made urban growth management possible. As he explained, here was a ruling that upheld an adequate facilities ordinance in a suburban town of Ramapo that basically said that it was legal for a town to withhold a development permit for up to 18 years without compensation until the town was able to provide adequate facilities according to its ordinance. As he explained, it added a dimension of timing and sequencing to development regulations that basically we just had not tested in the courts at all. And as you know, under a zoning scheme, you can leapfrog within the jurisdiction of the municipality from the urban area to the rural fringe altogether. And so, and also, and as important, the ruling emphasized the linkage that most of us today in planning recognize as an essential linkage between land use planning and infrastructure planning, and in particular transportation planning. And this, of course, was a major tenet, a major central belief in urban growth management. So this was a huge milestone for planning. of course, I don't think the courts would rule this way today. And that would be an interesting issue to explore. But now I want to tell you a little bit about how I met Professor Freilich. And this was in 1987. I was a new manager of policy and research for the newly established Office of State Planning in New Jersey. This was an office that was created to develop the state's first development and redevelopment plan. And I came on board in March of 1987, and my first task was to develop a draft plan within 3 months out of the reports of 4 consulting teams. And actually, there was no master consulting firm.
Right.
So they were all working at their own pace, on their own pretty much, and we had to somehow or another pull it all together. And of course, Professor Freilich was our lead land use law consultant, and he was in charge of producing the scheme for new development. And Dr. Bob developed a 5-tier system for New Jersey. And I guess it must have come right after the San Diego
Yeah,
plan, right?
it was about 12 years later, yeah.
Oh, well.
Okay.
So the tiers went from urbanized areas to critically environmentally essential areas. I should also say something about the tier system. I think the tier system is really a much more advanced concept than the urban growth boundary. Most of you probably know about the urban growth boundary because of the Oregon and now the Washington plans, because they incorporated and so on. But I think the tier system is much more sophisticated because, first of all, very often it involves more than just a couple of tiers and so on. And I know, for example, that both in Oregon State and in Washington State, they have been debating whether to add another tier beyond what they have. Right now, what you've got in the urban growth boundary is urbanized areas, areas to be urbanized within the urban growth boundaries, and then everything outside, which is to, to have very little development, if any at all. But the problem for these systems is that, okay, so you have a development capacity of 20 years within the urban growth boundary, but again, it could happen anywhere, and which is the problem of leapfrogging that they've tried to address, but also there's no way of telling how the urban growth boundary will grow in the future. And so they have been debating whether to add another tier to provide more guidance about the next sequence of development. So I think this also shows that Professor Freilich's tier system is a more sophisticated mechanism than the urban growth boundary concept itself. Okay, getting back to New Jersey. New Jersey at that time was the most dense state in the nation because it was the most suburbanized state in the nation. New Jersey was totally covered by 567 municipalities, and that is, there were no unincorporated areas in New Jersey. And at that time, 2/3 of the state was undeveloped. But with the rate of suburbanization, the projections were that within 20 years or so, 2/3 of the state would be urbanized. And so people were concerned about this. The first version of the plan, which recommended, and not only because of Professor Freilich, but due to other consultants, but it actually recommended zoning large swatches of the state at about, I forget now, but about 20 dwelling units per acre. And it got us into hot water, of course, for developers, quite a lot. I think that within a week of the release of the draft, developers had raised about $1 million for a new foundation to pretty much fight the plan. It was called the Foundation for the Preservation of the American Dream. Well, the American Dream was pretty much identified with suburban home and so on, so you can understand that. But the developers cast the plan as trying to Manhattanize New Jersey, which of course was really a horrible thing to think about. in the second version of the plan, about 6 months later or so, we kept the tiers, but we also emphasized what I call communities of place strategy, which was basically a strategy for channeling development into a hierarchy of central places, from existing urban centers, new regional centers, to towns, villages, and hamlets. And we saw these centers as being more compact, having higher densities, appropriate mixed use, that is shopping, community facilities, pedestrian amenities, and appropriate transit depending on the scale of the center. Basically what we did was incorporate a regional design strategy to statewide planning. And we were the first to do this in the country before TODs became popular. This was about the time when new urbanism was beginning to get a lot of attention. Seaside had been newly developed. And I didn't meet Liz and Andres around this time. But I think my major influences in developing the strategy of communities of place was really the early compact city approach that we had developed in Berkeley when I was a student in, I guess it was 79, 81, with Alan Jacobs and Donald Appleyard, in which we basically, we actually published an urban design manifesto out of this. And it was an early compact city approach, higher densities, mixed use, livable streets, and so on. But at the same time, I think what really was a major influence on our approach was the wonderful historic towns and villages in New Jersey. And some of us lived in some of these towns. I lived, for example, in Lambertville, right on the Delaware, and so on. And these were wonderful little towns, about 4,000 people in Lambertville. They were compact, historically compact. They had higher densities than suburban development. They had lively main streets, and they actually had streets as well. And New Jersey had many of these wonderful historic towns and villages and so on. And I think our regional design strategy was pretty sophisticated for its time. We didn't cast the issue in terms of jobs, housing, balance. Traffic congestion was the number one problem that people identified in New Jersey at that time. But we knew that the work trips only accounted for about 1/5 or 1/6 of all trips. And so our communities of place strategy was really aimed at encouraging services that a center could support, a development could support. For example, it could be a small grocery store or a daycare center in a hamlet scale type of development. And neither were we so focused on transit as we are now. We recognized that more dense and compact development would better facilitate some types of transit, but we recognize that transit, to be efficient, requires densities that even denser development in suburban settings could not deliver. And our strategy for mixed use, I think, was also a bit more sophisticated than I think some of what you hear today, because it was aimed at cutting back on the non-work trips or shortening the length of those trips. And also our pedestrian amenities were here to facilitate a sense of community, a sense of place. And so I think that many of these ideas have become incorporated today in the new urbanism and in regional approaches to growth management today. I guess I want to end on a cautionary note about carbon emissions of 375. I lead the Center for Sustainable Cities, and I really do believe in that we have to reduce our carbon emissions. But at the same time, we have to recognize that compact development is only one part of the way in which we can reduce carbon emissions. And actually, it's a modest strategy for reducing carbon emissions altogether. And that compact development, there are many other reasons, and I think Professor Freilich pointed out many of these, why compact development is desirable. besides the modest reductions in DMT and energy savings that it can bring about. And that is infrastructure and public services, capital and operating cost savings. I think that's very important. The preservation of environmental sensitive land, especially land critical for our water resources and species. I think also this issue that new urbanism has made popular as well, facilitating a sense of community, of sociability, very important. And then also I think we have to pay attention to the type of development we do because of natural hazards, and in particular the climate change impacts that we will be experiencing more and more in the future, and that is sea level rise, wildfires, and certainly for many of the western states, we need to worry about much worse urban heat island effects than we already experience. So on. So in closing, I want to say that growth management, new urbanism, concern with low carbon cities have all marked advances in thinking and planning development from multiple perspectives in a more integrated way. Although I think we're still very far from planning in a more integrated way in sustainable cities. But I do believe that Dr. Bob has been at the forefront of these approaches, making major original contributions, especially for urban growth management. And I really thank him for coming here and telling us about
I just wanted to tell everybody here that this spring I'm going to be teaching a course, Land Use Controls, at the law school. And basically it is open for cross-enrollment from the School of Policy, Planning and Development. So it'll be a 3-hour course, and basically you won't have to take a final exam with the law students. Any non-law student can write a paper instead, and we select a suitable topic, etc. But I really do urge you, sometime during your career, Jim Kushner here is one of the leading authorities in the nation. His treatise, I think it's right, Subdivision and Growth Management Law, basically is just well known all over the country. He teaches land use law at Southwestern University Law School. So I do think that you ought to get some familiarity with how the law works in land use, because we are a statutory country, and we deal with ordinances and implementation, and everything we do gets decided in the courts one way or the other. So you need to know how to work with lawyers. You need to know how they can work with you, and just how to spot troubled areas and other things, but even to become more creative. I mean, if you just sat down and said to yourself, I have this problem. I mean, we want to deal with this growth over 7 years. It's just going to fill us all up with large lot zoning. How would I deal with it? Just imagine, put yourself into that exercise. And the way I came out with this thing isn't necessarily the way other people would have come out with it. There could have been many alternative approaches to that. And maybe some of them might have been better, or maybe they could have been coalesced. So your opportunity for growth in this field is really to become interdisciplinary, because that's what makes advancements in the whole field of social science, is basically when you look at some other discipline like the engineering of green systems, and you look at the planning, and you figure out, how do I get these two to advance into a new area? That's in my 40-year experience, is the way in which creativity occurs in this field. And I think all of you should have the confidence to know that you actually can do these things, okay? And that you can begin to put the caps on to see how you're going to respond. So I guess we have a few minutes for questions and answers. Yes, sir.
Yes, two questions. Where did the $7 trillion figure come from? Because I've seen the annual or biannual infrastructure report card, and that's usually around $2 trillion. And I was also wondering if you could comment about whether there have been any studies on transformation of standard urban sprawl area to one that's much more energy efficient, and sort of techniques that might work in the event of energy saving kind of thing.
Well, okay, the infrastructure number comes from, see, most infrastructure studies, you know, they'll look at roads, or they'll look at bridges, you know, they'll either be transportation oriented, they won't take schools into account at all, which is about $2.5 trillion of deficiencies. They won't look at all about, you know, emergency service or, you know, fire, what happens in these suburban communities, the sheriff, especially in unincorporated areas, the sheriff comes around once every 30 days, you know, and he basically says, hi y'all, you know, that's about all he can do. Yet these people move out there, I call them cappuccino cowboys, okay, because what they want is they want to have these large lots, right, but they want to have urban services. They want to have the school bus stop in front of the house. They don't want this kid to walk a mile to a school bus stop. You know? They want to have the police patrolling the streets 24 hours a day. They want fire service within 4-minute response times. But it's impossible. These are rural areas. They're rural environments. They deserve to have a rural character, and that's another whole subject we won't get into. But the problem with infrastructure is people don't really count all of the true infrastructure. And if you really do this, we were at 1.7 trillion in 1968 when the first infrastructure study came out of Congress.
What is it? Is that quoted somewhere?
Yeah, you can find it in my book. Just buy it. Okay, $76. It's all there. Okay, go ahead. All right, guys, don't be shy. Go ahead.
From a developer's point of view, I have a question like, what would be your suggestions for new American Dream?
Well, you see, I think that the development industry is on the verge of a tremendous resurgence in the country. Well, first of all, because we now know how to save the developer the upfront costs of green development, of solar, of rainwater capture, because we know how to create these public improvement districts on the property and use the savings in energy, the savings in water over the years to finance that. So that takes that off the back of the development community. It basically means there's no rational reason now why they can't build green, okay, and they can't build new urban. So that's very critical. And secondly, the profits. There's a lot of material in the book, but you can get any number of articles showing that if you build green, okay, your rental occupancies are higher, your lease rates are higher, your selling prices are higher. I mean, we have tons of studies showing this. Again, I think it's very important for planners to be familiar with economics and to understand that. I don't think development is the enemy. I think sprawl development was the enemy. And for a lot of developers, there was nothing else on the market because everybody was promoting this. I mean, think about it. The federal highway program pushed freeways out, endless distances, right? The FHA would only finance single-family homes out in suburbs. If you lived in the city, they had multifamily, low-income projects, et cetera. If you really look at everything the U.S. government did in the last 50 years, the income tax, the subsidy that we give, the massive subsidy for deduction of interest, mortgage interest, and real estate taxes, but not for renters. Renters get no deductions at all. I mean, all of these things skewed it towards this idea that that was the American dream, was the single-family detached home, okay? But things are rapidly changing now. Although we'll see in the next 2 years with a Republican Congress, if it ever comes about, what's going to happen to a number of these initiatives. But we'll see. On the whole, I think we are definitely moving. In 10 years, 15, 20 years' time, development will be wholly different in this country. I wish it got to look like Singapore or Beijing or Shanghai, except for one thing. I think our construction standards are better. And the other thing about Shanghai is nobody really knows this big secret, but they're building on marshland, okay? The whole city of Shanghai is going to be defunct in about 30 years because the water table keeps sinking and sinking, the land. And so it's the rush to judgment. But a lot of the Chinese techniques and other things, we need to learn a lot from the rest of the world. I'm going now to Dubai and going to 3 Arab Emirates to study their development patterns and planning and so forth. And we do have a lot to learn from the rest of the world. But they have a lot to learn from us about how really to deal with infrastructure problems and other things. Because I think that's one major problem the Chinese system has is they're really not dealing with a lot of these clean energy and other problems and so forth. And it's going to make a difference. Yeah, one last question. Anybody else? Come on. You want to ask another one? Go ahead.
Do you have any views on the development in India?
In India? You know, I was in India for 12 weeks about 15 years ago. I haven't really, I began to see the changes in Bangalore and some other cities. I haven't really seen the new India. And we are going to go next year. So, yeah, I think it'd be very interesting to study how they do it. And of course, the great thing about Indian cities are, especially in the south, those 7-walled ring cities, they're fabulous because they, each one specializes the fruits and the vegetables and the meats and the flowers and the things. It's just incredible, the mixture of life and the color and the vibrancy of those cities. Now, if they can integrate, new development and get it into the same character of community, that they've had, I think it's going to be great. But that's a challenge. I don't know whether or not they're meeting it or not. I haven't been there. I haven't seen a lot about it. Anyway, thank you all very, very much.